We might kick off. Welcome everybody. I think there's probably a few more people still join us, but we might get going. So good evening, everybody, and welcome. Great to see you all again for another session. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're all on traditional lands and we're on Gadigal land this evening. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country here and across Australia, wherever you all are located, and recognise their ongoing connection to lands, waters and culture. And we also pay our respects to elders past and present.
Great, thanks. Yeah, welcome everyone. So we've got a great session this evening. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce Ariel Gamble and Richie Merzian. Then once they're going to speak, just do a bit of a double act, and then we're going to ask them some questions, Karen and I, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone. So as always, pop your hand up or pop them in the chat. Tonight's topic, it's one we've had lots of interest in actually, and so it's very topical. We were just going through. There's a few articles in the paper, I think at the end of last week, is COP31, Australia's opportunity. So Australia is part of the Asia Pacific Regional Group and is looking to co-host COP31 with the Pacific Island nations. And the biggest COP venue, if it goes ahead for Australia, will be in Adelaide. The other country that's in strong competition with Australia for COP31 is Turkey. And I know Ariel will go through some of this, but I think around 30,000 delegates are expected to attend. And I think what they're talking about in terms of what's potentially making the Australia Pacific COP31 so significant is that it would highlight Pacific vulnerabilities, rising seas, extreme weather, and also centered around First Nations voices. Now, this evening, we're going to cover a range of areas related to next year's COP, and that'll include what is COP and why does it matter? How can COP31 drive domestic and global ambition? And how can all of us leverage this moment? So just introducing Ariel and Richie. So Ariel first. So Ariel is the co-founder and CEO of Groundswell, and that's a community that drives strategic climate philanthropy in Australia. And Carolyn and I have had a bit to do with her, and it's a really, really impressive organisation. Under her leadership, Groundswell has mobilised millions in funding for advocacy and solutions and become a key connector between people who care about the climate crisis and the change makers tackling it. Ariel is currently working closely on the National Philanthropic Strategy for COP31, with a focus on how Australia can seize this moment to lead, inspire and drive meaningful change at home and across the region. And then also I'll introduce Richie Merzian as well. So Richie is one of Australia's most experienced climate policy experts. He's got deep expertise in both international negotiations and domestic energy strategy. He is the CEO of the Clean Energy Investor Group, which represents institutional investors accelerating Australia's energy transition. Previously, Richie served as the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute, also as the International Director at the Smart Energy Council, and has had been a lead climate negotiator for the Australian Government at the United Nations. Richie has been working closely on strategy for COP31 and brings a wealth of insight into what this moment could mean for Australia and the region. So thank you very much, Ariel and Richie, and over to you both.
Thank you both. It's lovely to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thank you for the lovely intros as well. So my name's Ariel. I'm joining you tonight from Darug country, and I also want to pay my respects to the elders of this place, past and present and future leaders, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So here we are tonight to talk about COP31, which is very exciting, and I'm very excited to be here with Richie to have a conversation about it. I thought to sort of start up the framing, we spent a lot of time thinking about climate action, knowing that the clock is ticking and that we only have a few short years before our Earth's carbon budget runs out. So I'm sure, like many of you, we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the moments that we can leverage to unlock the kind of transformational change needed at this point in time. Through that, spend a lot of time thinking about tipping points. Tipping points can be really catastrophic moments like the Black Summer bushfires or breakdowns in feedback loops in the Earth's climate system. But every now and then we get a tipping point that we can actually plan for to leverage that kind of transformational change. That could be an election or it could be a moment of international significance. A moment that we can kind of galvanize around to create ambition, coordination, and courage. And I really believe that Australia Pacific, our opportunity to host COP31 in 2026 could really present one of these moments for leverage. It could be a once in a generation opportunity to shift gears, not just diplomatically, but economically and culturally and politically. Oh, sorry, somebody's saying you're not finding me as clear as I could be. How's everybody? Can you hear me very well? Or is it breaking up a bit? It's okay for everybody else? Perhaps there might be a tech issue on your computer, but please do let me know if it persists and we can try and work it out. So like I was saying, it could be a once in a generation opportunity, both here at home and globally, to really shift gears, something that we can mobilize around. But like everything, it's not a done deal. One sort of moment isn't a deal done. It's only going to be what we as a society choose to make it. So I'm really excited to be talking to Richie, who heads up the Clean Energy Investor Group. Like Stephen and Carolyn was saying, Richie has an incredible history in climate negotiations and the COP process. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about what the UN COP process is, where Australia's bid is up to, and why we think this moment really matters, and how we think everybody can and should get engaged. So I just want to flag that I'm not an expert. My role at Groundswell is connecting experts to the people who want to support the change. But over the past few years, I've been learning a lot about the COP process and convening folk who've led COPs, learning what worked, what didn't, and how we can try and leapfrog mistakes from the past. So I'm really keen to help others leapfrog my learning journey over the coming years. So tonight we're in very good hands with Richie, who's going to help guide us through that big picture. So Rich, I might start by opening the floor to you, and maybe you can give us a bit of a grounding in what the COP process actually is and what it's done and why it matters.
Thank you, Ari, and Stephen and Carolyn for a very warm welcome. I'm dialing in from the Ngunnawal country here in the capital. Pay my respects as well to the elders past, present, and those to come. So the COP is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change's Conference of the Parties. It is the annual meeting of all the countries in the world that signed up to the UN Climate Convention. And what they do when they meet, which is usually in November, is take stock of progress or lack of progress, and then come up with ways to actually put things back on track. It has been going on since '92. That's when the convention came together. And it is what we know of in terms of most United Nations processes. It is slow, it is incremental, it is by consensus, and it can be really frustrating. And I say this having worn a hat as a government official, having spent weeks in these rooms trying to negotiate over commas and semicolons in order to get language that was approved, all the way to being on the outside on the streets protesting. So I've had a few different roles in how to make this process work and recognize that it is a painful and tough process. Having said that, though, what it does do is also something quite magical, which is bring every country in the world together and to agree by consensus on how to actually move us closer towards 1.5 degrees of global warming and no more. And that entire idea of actually limiting global warming to below dangerous levels is a great example of the slow but sturdy progress that we can make within the UN system. Because what it does is it establishes norms that all the countries then work around, like putting hard infrastructure into place. It actually moves the process along so that we can all work and sing off the same song sheet. And this idea that the current Labor government has is to host for the first time ever one of these conferences of the parties. And for the first time ever, this will be COP31 if Australia is successful. That bid will take place next year in Adelaide in November, so November 2026. And what it will do is it'll bring the whole world to Australia. And 30,000 was the number that Stephen mentioned. That's a modest-sized COP. I was at a COP 2 years ago in Dubai where they had almost 90,000. And the reason they keep growing is because the COP is the de facto convening of all activists, all businesses, all trade organizations, all indigenous groups who want to do something meaningful on climate change. And everyone meets around it. So you have this UN system, which is party to party, country to country, that often happens in closed doors. But alongside that, you also have this convening function where everyone else meets and has events and conferences and announces initiatives and really progresses things. And that's really what's been growing. That's almost where the center of gravity's moved. So yes, you have these formal UN negotiations that are incremental, where everyone has to agree by consensus, but you also have this amazing flourishing of all these different opportunities and initiatives where everyone meets around the world, shares best practice, figures out what to do to push things along, as well as, takes to the streets as well in probably one of the biggest protests that you see happen on climate change as well, which tends to happen now as a set piece as well. Australia has never hosted something like this before. And what excites me most about it is it's adding something to our arsenal as people who want to see the Australian government take climate action. It adds something that we've never had before, which is a level of international scrutiny and accountability. Now, according to the official UN rules, each country is only responsible for the emissions that takes place on land. It's territorial emissions. Now, I see some knowing smiles because we all know that that is really the smaller end of Australia's contribution on climate change. Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world after Saudi Arabia and Russia, and it has a disproportionate role in exporting the problem to the world. What the COP does is it invites us to actually play a disproportionate role in coming up with a solution. And when the whole world comes here, it won't simply judge Australia based on its emissions in its electricity sector or its transport or what's happening on the ground. It will judge Australia based on its moral leadership on this issue. And on top of that, the Australian government's added this additional layer of accountability that it has invited Pacific neighbours to share the leadership and to co-host with the Australian government, which is a unique setup as well. Usually it's a single country that hosts, but the Australian government recognizes that for the Pacific, this is existential. For the Pacific, they've clearly said in the Boao Declaration in 2019, this is the #1 security threat to their countries and their livelihoods. And so the Australian government has offered an opportunity to share this space with the Pacific. And for the Pacific, they will certainly be using this to push as much as they possibly can to make the most progress on keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees and no more, because they are the ones who designed that initial pledge. For them, it was 1.5 to survive. And so the Paris Agreement in 2015, it was the Pacific Island nations that led that charge that actually got that language into the final agreement as well. So when all this comes together, you will see this amazing pressure point that would be building on the Australian government to really do something to go further than it's ever gone before. And for the Labor government, it's not just being better than the opposition. It is actually being better with the UNFCCC and with 1.5 and with the whole world setting the bar for what that betterment looks like. That's the exciting bit. And as someone who represents investors who are investing in clean energy, the really exciting part for investors, and certainly in the clean energy space, is the majority of our investment in Australia comes from overseas. So 70% of all our solar, our wind, our batteries, they're owned by international companies, international investors. If we want to actually transition the country, it will probably be off the back of a huge amount of international investment. And so the other part to this is that the COP now acts as the world's largest trade show on climate solutions. And so the whole world will be coming to Australia, checkbook in hand, ready to invest in the government's future made in Australia, ready to invest in our net zero economy. And the best part is, any future made in Australia will be a future made in partnership with Asia. The majority of our fossil fuels, our coal, gas, go to China, Korea, and Japan, and they will equally face additional scrutiny and additional interest in how they move forward as well. And the opportunities, right, with Asia on our doorstep, providing most of the climate manufacturing for solutions, but also representing the largest share of emissions, is that the whole world needs to work with Asia, both to supply them with the climate technology to transition, but also so that they can invest back into Asia to actually help them on their transition journey as well. And we haven't had a COP on this side of the world in the APAC region since 2007 in Bali, which was the first COP I attended and which really got me involved in this. So that's probably a long way of saying there's a lot on the line if Australia can secure this COP and can deliver it in partnership with the Pacific and can make the most of this opportunity.
Thank you, Richard. So interesting. Some people might have seen in the news over the past while that the bid isn't yet secure. And in fact, Turkey have a competing bid in with Australia Pacific. Could you tell us a little bit about the story there, what it means and what we can sort of expect over the coming year?
So the way that the COP hosting arrangements work is it rotates through the 5 UN regional groups. So that's Africa, Asia Pacific, South America, Eastern Europe, and then what's called Western Europe and others. And Western Europe and others is really what we think of when we think of the West. So it's, you know, a couple of North American countries, it's Australia, New Zealand, it's Western Europe, and it also includes a few other OECD members that are kind of on the margins, and that includes Turkey. And in order for the regional group to agree on who the host is, it has to be a consensus-based decision. So Australia and Turkey are vying for the support of the rest of the 28 or so members of this Western Europe and other group. Now, Australia has the support of almost everyone in that group. And on top of that, it has the support of the Pacific Island nations as well, which is sort of a block of 14 countries too. And more broadly, there's a more compelling reason to have a COP on this side of the world, because we've just had 4 COPs in the Middle East and North Africa region. And so there is a strong case there. Having said that, the Turkish bid is not one based on rational, logical reasons. It is, in a sense, Turkey doing what it often does, which is leveraging UN processes so that it can horse trade for other things that it wants in the UN system. And until the Australian government can find a way to incentivize the Turkish government to move out of the way, then their bid will, in a sense, block any consensus, which means that it will continue to drag on in this gray area of no one having a very clear decision on who will host. Now, the Australian government was hoping, last month when it went to mid-year sessions of the UN climate negotiations that it would sort it out. That didn't happen. And so what that means is it'll probably take all the way till November this year when there's a COP in Brazil for that decision to actually be made, which is disappointing because we could really use an 18-month runway to know that we're going to have the bid and to host it, because this will be the largest event that Australia's ever hosted outside sports. So this will be the most substantial event, I'll put it like that. It's certainly the largest event that Adelaide has ever hosted as well. And so we need the time to get just our logistics sorted, let alone all the ambition that we actually want to build on top of it to make this a successful COP for what it's supposed to do, which is to actually progress climate action. So right now we're in a bit of this holding pattern. The media that you mentioned in the last week goes to more, has the Australian government been doing everything it can to secure the bid? Now, I personally have gone on record to say no, it hasn't. And not just because I'm super keen for them to secure the bid, it's because I've seen the Australian government when it really, really wants something on the multilateral level. And for those who remember, I think a couple of years ago, the coalition government wanted to get Mateusz Kormann a job as the head of the OECD, and it rolled out the red carpet, gave him the private jet to fly around. Morrison, as prime minister, got on the phone and rang others to lobby, and they managed to make that happen, right? And something which I think is probably less consequential to our nation than hosting this. Another example, which is under a Labor government, was when we wanted to have a UN Security Council seat. And the Labour government built a big task force in DFAT, appointed ambassadors all over the world to go out and spruik, made deals with countries, and Kevin Rudd flew personally all over the world to try and get that bid sorted. With this one, it's been mainly the pet project of the Climate and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, who I think has been doing an excellent job as a champion, but he alone can't secure this. We need the foreign minister also involved, and we need the prime minister personally interested in making this happen, rather than just allowing his ministers to kind of do what they want to do. And that's what I want to see. I want to see a whole of government mission, because that's what it's going to take to really make this a success. It's if we bring the entirety of our government, but more importantly, the entirety of our community onto this. And that's the real opportunity. And that's why it's so good to talk to you all here today, because I'd love to turn you all from interested into advocates for this idea.
Thank you, Rich. It's really interesting, isn't it? And I think it's great to see the press coming out. I've just popped a link in the chat for those online to see some of the public pressure that's starting to build, asking the Australian government to step up in their efforts to secure this COP31 bid. There's different scenarios for what this COP looks like in terms of it reaching our shores. And there is a scenario in which Turkey miraculously wins the bid, but certainly the world that I'm in, and the philanthropy world and civil society organising, we are planning, because we can't afford to wait another 6 months to see whether the COP bid will be locked in. So we've been planning and organising and laying the foundations needed, but certainly come November, there's going to be a massive gear shift in terms of the level of interest and activity that mobilises towards the COP31 in Adelaide. And in some ways, there's a really interesting piece of kind of a bit of grace at the moment that we have to activate and organise within our communities. But like I said earlier, COP is only going to be what we make it. There could be a very low ambition COP that is essentially a conference in Adelaide for diplomats, or COP could be a national moment that really reshapes our national story from a fossil fuel petrostate into a clean energy leader that prioritises climate justice. The difference between that is what we all do. Richie, I would love to invite your reflections on what a successful COP could look like, and potentially even some thoughts on what it would take to get us to that vision of success in your mind.
Yeah, of course. And Ari, I thought you put it wonderfully. And Ari's been on this journey for the last 2 years. She was quite modest, but she's been helping to champion this along the way. How we embrace this opportunity shapes the opportunity. And most Australians haven't been to a COP. They've heard a little bit about it when it does pop up, especially when it's big political and there's a bit of friction, like at the Glasgow COP when Prime Minister Morrison didn't want to go, then eventually, was kind of forced to go, and all the hoo-ha around that, and net zero as a commitment, or Copenhagen even. And so the understanding is limited. We need to take that and we need to actually build that out and build broad support for the COP. Like, it is true, it's incremental and slow, and in the words of Greta Thunberg, it can be a lot of blah, blah, blah. That's entirely true. But it can also do some amazing things. And I've seen it firsthand. And a good example is when the UK hosted Glasgow, and that was under a Conservative government under Boris Johnson. Now, they'd just gone through Brexit, which is this huge home goal, and it kind of, in a sense, excised themselves from multilateral initiatives by removing themselves from the EU bloc. And so for the UK, this was an opportunity for them to really cement themselves back into that space as a global shaper and leader. And Boris Johnson came up with 4 priorities. He said, I want the COP to deliver on cash, cars, coal, and trees. And so he went about over the 2 years in the lead up to their COP and really shaped global initiatives around transitioning finance to align with net zero, the cash, around a big electric vehicle push to have electric vehicle targets. And this is back in 2021. That's the cars. a big push around phasing out coal power. And this is sort of the UK as the birthplace of coal power, now not only leading the charge, but also transitioning. And when we were there, I think they were shutting down their last coal-fired power station. So they were being an exemplar for what they wanted to see, as well as pushing for an initiative to get global support. And the last one was trees, around a big deforestation pledge that I think had about 140 countries ultimately sign up out of 195. And so what he did was hedge it. He said, yes, there's some UN negotiations and we will seek progress there. In addition to that, I'm going to bring together the finance sector in the UK and the big car manufacturers in Europe, and and a whole bunch of forest nations, as well as like a whole bunch of countries that still rely on coal power. And I'm going to lead initiatives on each of these four. And I'm going to reach out into the community. I'm going to work with academics. I'm going to work with different sectors of the industry. I'm going to work with a whole variety of partners, both in the UK and beyond, in order to bring countries and build this momentum, and then have a platform. So I'm going to bring like global leaders. I'm going to bring industry titans all to Glasgow and provide them with a platform to announce what they can actually do to contribute. And so for the UK, it was an opportunity for them not just to cement themselves once again as a multilateral player, but to also do something quite innovative in really pushing for these new platforms, these new initiatives, and in so doing, cementing the UK right in the middle of it. And so what he ultimately did was just fast track their clean energy transition. And so, for example, the UK had a goal of trying to phase out the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035, which was quite ambitious. But with the COP behind and with a lot more interest and opportunity, he brought that forward to 2030, basically being one of the most ambitious countries outside of Norway in terms of the EV transition, just as one example. Same with coal power. They fast-tracked the closure of their last coal-fired power station so they could exemplify what it looks like to move away from coal power as the backbone of your electricity grid. So that's the opportunity that you can do if you really do bring this all to a head. And for those outside government, then, and I'm happy to kind of explore what that looks like, where there's all these different initiatives and opportunities that we can connect into. And the reason I keep saying how we embrace it will shape it is because, one, we need to advocate for how this can be an opportunity and push past that initial skepticism we might have about the process and what it's delivered or not delivered in the past. And the second is we need to sort of plug into where we can really add value. And whilst the Australian government will do what it can, I think most of the ambition that we want to see, we will have to drive from the outside, which is why I'm working with multiple partners around incubating ideas or building coalitions so that we're ready to go as the COP approaches, in order to make sure that we make the most of this opportunity. And if we do, then there's no reason why November 2026 we couldn't have the Prime Minister announce that once and for all, Australia will stop opening up new gas and coal projects, move away from fossil fuels, and fully embrace a net zero economy.
Thank you so much, Rich. What are some of those, just following on your thing, some of those working groups that you're involved in? Could you give us a little bit of a taste of the kinds of alliances that are coming together and having these discussions at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So the major group that I'm in is one that is involving about a dozen industry bodies. So I represent clean energy investors, but there's others that are like the Investor Group on Climate Change, the Australian Industry Group, Energy Efficiency Council, the Carbon Markets Institute, Property Council. So all coming at it from different angles, but we're basically putting on the table what we think would be the most impactful ideas that Australia could support, initiatives that Australia could create, or existing initiatives that we could demonstrate implementation on. So, for example, Australia has a target to get to 82% renewables by the end of this decade. That's an ambitious target, but we shouldn't really stop there, right? If we really want to add value, then we should be making more clean energy than we need and use that to power some of the most high polluting industries right now. And so if you take steel, for example, steel manufacturing, We supply a lot of the coal to Japan or Korea, which they then use to manufacture steel. But could we potentially look at how we bring some of that onshore in Australia and then use clean energy to power those industries? And could we come up with a couple of pilot projects that we could then announce in partnership with Korea or Japan or Southeast Asia or India alongside the COP? Could we do a big push around clean energy, around clean finance? Like we're doing a lot of work as a nation to reorient how we disclose our climate risk. But is there something more that we could build off the back of that to really help our whole region transition in terms of how we disclose our risk and how we address our risk? And of course, it's not always just about mitigation as well, equally about adaptation and loss and damage and climate finance, which is how we assist those countries who have been the least responsible for climate change to actually mitigate and adapt as well. And that'll be another core part, and certainly a part that the Pacific will want to champion and see as well. So what could we do in that space as well around financing, around adaptation planning and resilience?
It's incredible, all the work that's kind of coming together and all the brains that are really thinking about how we make the most of this moment. Just thinking about the worlds that I'm involved in and the organising that I'm seeing on the ground at the moment, there's some incredible, I suppose, long-term convening projects from Pacific leaders and Pacific diaspora and Pacific communities, thinking about how they can have those early conversations to work out what the priorities that they're going to push so hard and advocate for are. And speaking to philanthropy here in Australia, because there's an urgent need to resource this convening and resource this work. We're also seeing really interesting strategies building around the climate movement, around the social license of fossil fuels, and how we can really help build that kind of public support for a shift beyond fossil fuels and towards clean energy through narratives and campaigns. So there's been a lot of really interesting thinking being done around particularly the social license of gas and just how much that industry is ripping every Australian off, and how we can sort of build on the great narratives that really started to emerge around the election of making polluters pay and helping sort of mainstream them, I guess, beyond the left and into mainstream society through that shared Australian value of a fair go. I think I'm seeing some really interesting work from First Nations leaders, particularly Amelia Telford and Larissa Baldwin, who are the founders of Common Thread, but you might know them through their former roles at Seed Mob or Australian Progress or Get Up. They're doing actually generational style thinking with their new organisation Common Threads about power building through First Nations communities around the country. And they have an incredible vision for COP and how they can ensure that land rights are at the heart of it, and it builds on the Indigenous justice work that's happening in the Amazon of Belém this year at COP30. So they're creating a lot of international relationships and connective narratives there. And then I think the last thing that I'd really love to highlight is that when we think of COPs that the world remembers, where are they? What are they? Paris COP, where we decided on what we're committed to 1.5. Beyond the diplomatic negotiation hall, that city was alive with artists and society and culture mobilizing and creating that kind of level of energy that opens up possibilities around leadership. And similarly, the Glasgow COP really sounded like it was a society really got behind it, and it was help, that great 4-word slogan of cash cars, coal and trees. But they also were able to expand it onto the streets and through society. However, my first introduction to COP was through one of the strategists, Charlie Ogilvie, who's I'm sure a shared friend. He was one of the organisers of the Glasgow COP. And when we asked him, what would you have done differently? He said, I would have invested in culture earlier. And Australia, I think, is just so unique when we compare our opportunity next year compared to the Azerbaijan COP or the Dubai COP. we have a vibrant civil society where protest is allowed. And South Australia, we've got to work on those protest laws in advance. We've got to work with the government to work with them, but we do. We have a vibrant civil society, active culture, incredible stories across First Nations and Pacific communities, and also across the broader Australian communities as well. So I think there's a lot that we can do around using this moment to shift narrative and social license for greater climate ambition. And that's something that we're thinking about a lot at Groundswell. I might jump into the next thing that we wanted to talk was how people on the call can get involved, and different ways that we can all be useful. I might start with a few thoughts that I've been reflecting on, and then invite you, Richie, to share your reflections too. How does that sound? So the first thing I'd say is, like Richie said, this Australia Pacific hosting COP31 isn't a done deal. So advocating for the bid, as we've seen Richie in the papers doing, activating your community and encouraging bipartisan political support is really important. I'd encourage all of you to use your voice to reinforce what COP31 could be. There's rightfully skepticism around COPs and the role that they've played. They can be polluter takes all experiences, but we need to, like I said before, it will only be what we can make it. And if we can mobilise for an ambitious COP, this could be one of our last moments to achieve that kind of global leverage that it presents. So talking to your networks, MPs, or any peak bodies that you're part of about backing the bid, engaging with specific stakeholders that you might be across to understand and amplify their priorities as well. Allyship, I think, is incredibly important if we're going to be proper partners in this bid. It sounds like from Carolyn and Stephen that you're all coming from really interesting different professional backgrounds. So thinking about how you can organise across your sector, whether that's health or finance or agriculture or arts, to help shape what COP31 looks like in this country, and think about how you could mobilise your industry. I work in philanthropy, so of course we need coordinated and really well-resourced planning and action. So that includes people backing the people doing the heavy lifting. So if you can, whether that's small dollar donations or large donations, really thinking about how you can support civil society organising campaigners to shape public support and accountability, funding research and convening efforts, and that kind of the policy development that Richie is speaking to. And then I think just using your platform, so thinking about how we can all encourage everyday people to understand what this process is that's coming to the country, and how we can use it to shape our public story and our national story. What about you, Rich? What would you encourage folk to think about?
That was a great list, Ari. There's, I mean, if you're interested in this space, there's definitely some background reading that you could do if you want to sort of beef up, I guess, on what the opportunities entail, and how to best talk to it. So what we also need is we need more advocates out there talking to this and speaking to this as an opportunity that we should all kind of consider. Whatever it is, it's brought us towards wanting to use our energy and our resources to engage in climate action. This is, I think, probably going to be the biggest thing that the government delivers on this term of government, but also probably the biggest opportunity we have on the climate agenda. I think back to sort of the deep disappointment we all had when the government approved the North West Shelf decision. And I think this is a system that we haven't been able to change with everything that we've brought to bear in the last multiple decades. Hosting a COP is giving us something that we've never had before, which is an international moment that we'll have right here on our doorstep. And so learning how to speak to that and to speak to the economic opportunity. If you listen to the federal government, they want to host this because they see this as the world's largest trade show for climate solutions. And they want to use this almost like a coming out party for Australia to say, we're serious. We want to be part of this global network, this global economy, that is orienting towards net zero. And more than that, they want to show that there is a credible alternative to fossil fuels. And that's the opportunity we have to kind of craft that. And so there's a whole bunch of different ideas that we can be working to, but really just talking to this as an economic opportunity, I think is key. And a lot of us are coming from different sectors where we could potentially do that as well. And I'm happy to pop a paper on the chat as well that I wrote with the Climate Council last year around what are the economic opportunities, and also what does this mean for the Pacific as well? Because I know a lot of people are interested in that, and the paper was co-written by a number of Pacific Island academics as well, who can talk to some of the different ideas there too. But there's a lot that we can bring to this. And it doesn't matter that we're not based in South Australia, which I'm guessing most people on the call are not based in, because this is, in a sense, a national and a regional undertaking. And what's really exciting about the COP is that you often have numerous different mayors from around the world attend, state premiers. I was talking to Matt Keane last week. I often see him, probably more likely to see him at a COP than I am, in Australia, given that it does tend to attract a lot of people who want to see climate action, whatever the jurisdiction is that they're working in, whatever the community they want to work in as well. There's usually a way to connect into it. And so whatever your particular interest is, a lot of different industry groups and industries organize it around it as well. So if you are part of an industry group, it's probably good to ask, what they're doing, or a professional association. And then there's particular organizations that are specifically working on ideas as well that you could probably get involved with in whatever way you feel comfortable engaging on as well. And I saw Felicity popped in as well. Tourism will be huge. This will be the biggest thing that Adelaide's ever hosted. Everyone's worried that they won't have enough hotel beds, and they won't. So, if you want, book your Airbnb now and pay up front before all the prices just go through the roof. But it'll be really interesting to see but the South Australian government see this as an opportunity to really sell this version of South Australia, given that they've pioneered renewables at a level that I think is only second to Denmark in terms of the levels of renewables they have in their grid right now. And what they're trying to do in Whyalla and numerous other areas of the state is showing that you can actually build a viable net zero economy that moves past fossil fuels, or at least is trying to. But we're talking as well to the Energy and Climate Minister in New South Wales, Penny Sharp, who's interested in what Sydney can do, whether it can potentially host a business summit. Climate Action Week, there's often a lot of stuff around COP31, but organizing through existing community vehicles as well. And I know COP31 will be a big theme for Climate Action Week Sydney in March next year as well. And I know, talking to the Department of Climate Change, they definitely see this as a national undertaking and want to see every state and city play a role as well. So there will be opportunities to go to your local member, to go to your state member, or your local council, and ask what they're doing or how they're engaging or whether they're supporting. And the last thing is, and this gets to what Ari was saying, like do write to your MP or talk to your politicians. I live in Canberra, so I live and breathe politics. And if there's one thing I know, it's that politicians will disappoint those who they can afford to. And so we need to show that there's a lot of people who want this COP to happen. Otherwise, they could very well disappoint us. So let's ensure that they don't.
Thank you, Rich. I think over to you, Carolyn and Stephen. That brings us to...
Thanks, Ari. That's fantastic. Thanks, Richie. Really, really good. That's so interesting. Could listen to both of you for a long time. So thank you. So I've got a couple of questions here, and then certainly throw it over to the group. So if you've got any questions, please just raise your hand or pop them in the, got a few questions coming in the chat. Maybe one just to kick off, Richie, maybe over to you. It sounds like you've been to lots of COPs. In terms of how they've changed, particularly around the sort of topic of adaptation, which you referred to, do you want to just chat to that a little bit in terms of how that's, I suppose, become more common now?
Sure. Yeah, I had the opportunity of being Australia's adaptation negotiator for a number of years. And adaptation was just a poor cousin to mitigation. And it didn't really get much airtime. Everyone was focused on mitigation. They saw adaptation almost as a capitulation, rather than a necessary complement to undertaking emissions reductions. But as things have moved slower than we've wanted, the need for adaptation has grown, and the recognition that we can only adapt to a certain point, and then there's ultimately loss and damage. And that has really come to the fore as well. And so now in the UNFCCC, you're seeing a much larger share of the conversation around adaptation. Countries design national adaptation plans, which are called NAPs, and how they actually build up their capability so that they can better connect into financing, and how there's dedicated financing vehicles, particularly for developing countries, least developed countries, to access. And the same with loss and damage, that there'll be a certain level of loss and damage that is inevitable now. How do we come up with ways of actually supporting countries who are on the tail end of that? You know, if you're Vanuatu, you know, and you have another tropical cyclone come through, it can wipe out, you know, the entirety of your GDP for a year. So how do you actually deal with that loss and damage as well? So these are big conversations that are taking place right now in the UN, and the need is made all the more greater with, you know, with global shifts, with USAID, with the US aid being completely withdrawn from the region, and people now trying to fill that hole as well. So it is a live conversation. At the last UN climate conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, countries agreed on a new global financing goal as well. And so I think it was about 300 billion to be mobilized by 2035. That's from public funding, and then about 1.3 billion total, including private finance as well. And so there is a huge financing gap in terms of where we're at and what we need. And so that is an ongoing conversation around how we can best support all these nations.
Yeah, fantastic. And you referred to the US there a little bit. I mean, in terms of how impactful are the US and, you know, obviously their current policies on climate and things on COP and its ability to get outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am an optimist, so I'll put that as a caveat. But one thing I take stock in, President Trump flagged that he was going to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement before he was elected, and then flagged it would be one of his first acts, undertook that on day one, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and not a single country has followed him out of that agreement. Not a single one. And the reason why is not because everyone is morally bound to the UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement, which is how you implement everything to keep to 1.5 degrees. They did it because it's in their economic interest to stay in. Because every new power station that's being built is either wind or solar or hydro, maybe nuclear, but not really in a large number. But it's certainly not coal or gas. And there are a few exceptions, but that is certainly the majority. Why? Because the economics has shifted, and the cheapest power you can build right now is clean energy. And if you want to actually deal with the consequences of climate change, if you want financing for adaptation, if you want to deal with loss and damage, then it's much better to stay in the tent than to pull out. And even if you take a country like Argentina that was talking about following Trump out of the Paris Agreement, in the end they reconsidered it because they realized that would be hugely detrimental to their relationship with the Europeans and a lot of the finance flowing into Argentina. So the economics have shifted so much in the last 10 years that I think there's something really powerful behind that narrative as well. And if you ask me why Australia and why the Labor government put their hand up to host the COP now and not 10 years ago, it's because they see the economic opportunities behind transitioning to net zero, but they need the international support to get there, literally to finance the transition, but also in solidarity to actually give them the support they need to take the Australian public on that journey. And that's the real opportunity here, to really nail that and show that there is a credible green net zero economy just waiting for us if we move towards it and make the right steps.
Yeah, fantastic.
Richie, what do you, just building on that, what do you think is the hesitation in the Australian public in sort of, because we know that a lot of people are concerned, it's something like 80% are concerned about climate. So many people have got solar on their roofs. So what is that kind of barrier in Australians' minds?
Yeah. The first thing to say is that according to the Lowy Institute and their annual poll, 70% of Australians support the idea of hosting a COP. So there is support for the idea of Australia hosting, and that hasn't wavered in the last 3 years. And the majority of Australians want to see climate action. They want to see the nation take climate action as well, right? The question is around cost. It's always been around cost, and whether climate action is perceived to be costly or climate impacts is perceived to be costly, and which one's greater. And that's what's really shifted over the last 10 years, is that the economics have changed. Yeah, and if I think about the Eraring coal-fired power station in New South Wales, right? The reason why Origin Energy wanted to close Eraring was because it was no longer economic for them to run that coal-fired power station. Like, that's what's ultimately going to change it. But until we have confidence to make some of the big investments, the big plays in other industries, and look, the electricity's come a long way, power's come a long way, and the price of solar and wind and batteries has all reduced dramatically. And we need to see that as well with electric vehicles, and we're starting to see that happen now. We need to see that with some of the other industries as well. And then we'll feel confident to make that final shift out of mining too. So I think the economics are really the big part of this conversation. And the more we can explain that really the economics have shifted and we need to shift with it, the better we'll be for it. And there are obviously headwinds. We're seeing this now. But I don't think they're enough to stop it.
That's so interesting. Thank you. We've got a question in the chat from Amanda. What's the role, if any, in terms of the lead up to COP30? So how can we use the lead up to COP30 to enhance Australia's bid for COP31?
Yeah, it's a good question. In the next month, the Climate Change Authority will hand down their recommendations for what Australia's 2035 target should be. And then that target will be submitted to the UN in September. So that's sort of the timeline. And the Secretary General is going to have a big conference in September around generating ambition towards these targets. And then that will then feed into Brazil and the COP in November in Belém as well. And so the conversation quite soon, in probably the next month and a half, will turn to what level of ambition should Australia have in the medium term. Because in a sense, we know what the target is for 2030. Labor's not changing that. They're keeping it at a 43%. And so what will that target be for 2035? Because that will ultimately determine how ambitious Australia will become in terms of its transition. And that there'll be a big conversation around that. Not a lot of it will be informed, but that'll probably be the main platform with which we explore the merits and the issues around taking significant climate action and hosting the world's largest climate conference as well. So I think within that conversation, which is really the level of Australia's ambition, we should basically be backing in Australia's plan to be as ambitious as possible. And as part of that, really connecting the NDC, that 2035 target, to hosting the COP next year. And the way I would do it if I was being asked is that Australia is going to be putting forward an ambitious target for 2035. Between now and then, there's a lot of work that we need to do in all these different sectors, a lot of financing that we need to mobilize. There's a lot of different communities that we need to take on that journey. There's a lot of work we need to do with First Nations, a lot of work we need to do on social license. So breaking that down into particular sectors or particular plans and where we're best able to actually address it based on our own personal expertise, and then mapping out what that plan looks like and how we get there.
Seems like COP31, I mean, that's going to help us. If we had COP31, it would help. If we're going to set an ambitious target for, which we hope the Climate Authority does, it sounds from everything you've said like COP31 would just help gather momentum.
Most definitely. If you think about it, every sector, every particular aspect of our economy will be there. The farmers in the ag sector will be there. talking about best farming practices and agri-renewables and adaptation as well. Like every sector of the economy will be there. All the proponents will be there, as well as communities talking about like how do they actually best work together? How do they support action? How do they build their own resilience and adaptation? So all these things can benefit from us all coming together for this opportunity, as long as we can kind of build it along the way. And look, the Australian government is basically playing a really low profile on the COP between now and COP 30. And I understand why they're doing it, but I don't agree with it. They're keeping a low profile because it's still a bid, but also because they're worried about inviting another climate war.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, which is fair enough, but you can't stop that from happening. It will happen anyway. We're already seeing Sky News build up, like all these conversations around the emissions from all the planes that are going to come here, or for what a waste of time it'll be. Like there's so many ways that you can poke holes into this plan, and I think what I've like, if you leave a space open, someone will fill it. And so
Yeah.
there's also a role for us to then get out there and actually advocate for it. And, it can be simple as really just talking to people in our communities about it. And it can be far more substantive if we want it to be as well. But there's certainly roles that we can be playing between now and then, because until COP 30, there won't be sufficient, there won't be a sufficient vision for COP 31 that'll be given to us. So we have to create it. And that's what we need to use this for. And the NDC is part of that, because there's already big pushback. A lot of people are like, whilst I was really happy no other country pulled out of Paris, you have seen some companies really use this as an opportunity to pull back, to fire their ESG, partners or senior officials, and shift back into, whatever it was that they that they had as an alternative. And so there are some headwinds that we will have to address, but the COP will be a massive opportunity and a massive boost, whatever it is that we're going to be doing.
Thanks, Richie. I just draw everyone's attention. There's some fantastic links in the chat to various different articles. If you haven't seen them, I definitely encourage you to copy them or take a look. We've got a couple more questions in the chat. The first one is, how do we avoid a voice outcome? Great question. Thank you.
It is a great question.
There's a lot of thought going into that, to be honest, and a lot of conversations around that. One of the biggest lessons I've been observing, really highlighted and being addressed, is how important it is to have early convening, and the work of Common Thread, who I mentioned earlier, really taking communities all around the country, engaging them in understanding deeply what COP31 is, what it means, how they can be part of decision processes, but beyond obviously beyond First Nations communities right around the country, creating the link that I just put in above from former CEO of Rewiring Australia, Dan Cass, speaks about how the government can take the journey of the public with them on the COP journey around illustrating consumer benefits. Like Richie said, illustrating all the wins that people all around the country can gain through a positive and ambitious COP process is super important. And that kind of having the convening work done right and done early, so that we can have a narrative that is cohesive. And there can be many different stories within that narrative, but they're all pointing towards the same place. I think the fractures of the voice took us in too many directions. But that kind of creating that roadmap to COP through narrative work, through public engagement, community engagement, and that requires support early. So that requires us to all be working now. It's not waiting 6 months out and then putting in some money. It's getting behind it right now through our treasure, time, talents, ties, testimonies, and helping to create that kind of that unifying framework that also allows for disagreement, because there's going to be lots of different perspectives. That is the nature of a national sort of moment, right? We've got to allow for that as well.
I think that's really interesting. If what you've just mentioned there, Ari, when I read Liz's question, which is there a strategic grassroots plan being formed to explain the massive opportunity for COP31? And I just really feel like that ties into what you just answered around. I don't know if you agree, but yeah, make sure there's some sort of coordination and proactive approach.
There is lots of coordination happening across the grassroots movement. So WWF have been doing a lot of early working, bringing together leaders from across the sector, but also the Climate Action Network Australia doing a lot of strategizing and convening. Convening is just going to be so crucial here. And so making sure that those bodies who are doing that convening work are really well resourced and supported is going to be really important too. And I think, finding ways to raise if voices are missing out of that conversation, finding ways to raise them in constructive ways is going to be really critical too.
Thank you. Look, I've got one question, and then just a couple of things that we wanted to cover before we wind up. I just want to ask, we've actually got someone coming in a couple of sessions' time to talk about the COP around biodiversity, which is a separate COP. But there is a discussion, if I understand it right, of potentially bringing them together. Can you give us just a little overview of what if that's outside your realm? Totally understand, but yeah, just how they might work together.
Do you want me to have a crack, Ari?
That'd be great.
So the Convention on Biological Diversity is sort of like the poor cousin to the UNFCCC. They were both created, the same sort of mother. They both came out of the Rio Convention in '92, but the CBD's never really gotten the same kind of airtime or traction as sort of the Nature COP. And so there is a conversation around whether the two can work closer together. I don't think they will. Just once you create an institution, it's very hard to kind of merge it or mobilize it or shift it out. So I think they'll still run on parallel tracks, but it doesn't mean that they can't work complementary and help each other. So there is, yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I don't work as closely on the CBD anymore, but it'd be interesting to see because they had quite an unsuccessful COP when the CBD last met. And
Right.
so they're still reeling from that failure. Ironically, Turkey put its hand up to host that COP and then pulled out late after successfully securing the bid, just to give you an example of Turkey's actions. And so the CBD, in a sense, has a lot of work to do to kind of build back that confidence and that support. It's possible, but it's tough.
Right.
Yeah, so we'll see.
Yeah, thanks, Richie. Interesting. Lots of great comments about how eye-opening this session's been for people around COP and what's involved and everything. It's great. Just a quick one here that Mitzi asks is about, can we discourage fossil fuel corporations from being such a big presence at COPs?
We can discourage it, but we will not be able to stop it.
Mm.
And that's because, ironically, it comes down to sovereign authority. And if I'm Saudi Arabia and I want to bring a country delegation that involves bringing over 50 members of Aramco, my national oil company, that's entirely within my sovereign decision to do that, and they represent Saudi Arabia, or I give them Saudi Arabian badges as national government. And multiple countries do that, and not just the ones who we think of as sort of being petrostates, but Norway might bring and give badges to Equinor, its oil company as well. So it's unfortunately part of the fabric, and it's something that we can't avoid, even if we wanted to. All we can do is overwhelm the fossil fuel interests with everything else that we can bring to the table. And the other benefit here that we have that we didn't have in many other places, like in Azerbaijan, which is a petrostate for gas, or Dubai, which is a petrostate for oil, is we have a democracy that we can call on. We have a relatively free media. Like, there are opportunities for us to actually use our position. And this is why hosting a COP in a democracy is so important, so that we can actually have accountability and transparency in a way that we can't when it's in the Emirates or when it's in Azerbaijan or when it's in Egypt or even Turkey. And this is the other risk of having it in Turkey. It's not just that we miss out on a huge opportunity for Australia, we miss out on an opportunity to actually cement the next wave of climate ambition at a time when multilateralism is facing a lot of threats from the US and from other quarters as well. That's the other concern that we have. Like, this is not just a good thing for Australia and the Pacific. This is a necessary thing for global climate action.
Yeah.
Which is why we need to be beating the drum on this one as well. And the final thing to say is we talked about NDCs, these targets for 2035 coming forward. Australia's bringing forward its target. Every nation in the world's been asked to bring forward its target. The targets will not add up to 1.5 degrees or less of global warming in terms of their level of ambition, which means that the COP after Brazil, when all these targets are due, is even more important when it comes to global ambition and how we each play a role there as well. And so if we think about the opportunity here, it's not just that this will be excellent for Australia, and I do really think this could be pivotal, probably the most critical moment for our clean energy transition, is that this is necessary for the world as well.
Yeah.
And we'll do the best job, including trying to limit the influence of fossil fuel interests at the COP.
Yeah, fantastic. Just one more for you both. So Matt just asked, will showcasing threatened Pacific Islands to international audiences, in brackets voters, materially help build international resolve for more action?
Harry, do you want to go?
Sorry, it's an interesting question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Richie, knowing that you've been at the table around the leadership that's already been on demonstrated by the Pacific at these conferences for so many years.
Yes, Matt, I do think so. I think there's something really critical. Like, I think back to when Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, was invited to Tuvalu for the Pacific Island Forum. And when he walked off the plane, he had to walk past all these tanks of water that had kids in them, just like big fish tanks to represent the fact that their islands were drowning, right? And it just made for such a hectic moment. And then that became like the conversation. It was all about, like the disparity between Australia's interests and what the Pacific needed. I've seen it in terms of being involved in hosting a global climate financing meeting in Samoa and seeing how the Samoan government took them out to spots that had just been demolished because of climate impacts, and seeing how funders shifted in terms of their appreciation for what was actually happening on the ground. So I do think so. And also I think the Pacific thinks so as well. For the Pacific Island representatives, they've had to travel around the world to make their cases. And this is the first time ever that they'll be able to bring the whole world to their corner of the world. And there will be a number of meetings hosted in the Pacific as well. I think as part of this, there's a big preparatory or pre-COP meeting that I reckon will probably be in Fiji or somewhere large enough to host it. And then there'll probably be other meetings as well. I think soon we'll be having the results of the ICJ case and the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice around the case being brought forward around climate change as a human right. So like, yeah, and that's just another example of the Pacific really knowing how to use multilateral systems to elevate their voice. And so I do believe that there will be a lot that will come out of that angle.
Thanks so much, Richie. What a really super session. Been absolutely packed with amazing, learnings and deeper understandings about COP. So thank you both so much. I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. Ariel, I just wanted to ask you, people might not know the amazing history of groundswell. And I just wondered in 30 seconds or a minute if you could explain the philosophy behind groundswell and some of the achievements that you've had in the last 4 or 5 years since you started.
Oh, thank you. That's a lovely question. Sure. Well, I'm one of the founders of Groundswell. We started in 2020. I started with 2 friends. One was Anna Rose, who was a 20-year climate campaigner. The other was Claire Herschel, who comes from a background in philanthropy. And together we could see that there was this kind of gap between people who cared about climate change and those who are and the amazing change agents who are already leading on solutions. And so we came up with an idea around, Groundswell is about collective power. It's connecting people into strategic climate action through collective funding and also convening around key issues. So we have a couple of giving circles where people pull their money and we make grants to strategic action. So little donations can actually go a really long way. A $20 gift can turn into a $40,000 or an $80,000 grant. And then we also bring people together at industry levels and kind of cross-pollinations across business and culture and philanthropy to kind of think outside of the box and mobilize collective power towards solutions. So my interest in COP got started a couple of years ago when we ran a trip with some different leaders across culture and business and philanthropy. And we had one of those Glasgow organisers who said, what are you going to do about this thing that's coming up in a few years? And so a working group started and a lot has sort of sprung out from that. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more about Groundswell, please do come and check us out. And if you're interested in funding climate action or getting involved in any of these groups, would love to hear from you and really appreciate the opportunity, Carolyn and Stephen, to share with you all tonight.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Ari. And Richie, thank you so much for making the time. And thanks for all your fabulous work. And yeah, look forward to doing whatever we can, I'm sure, as a group and getting right behind you. So well done. Thank you so much. Really, really great. So thanks to everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed tonight's session. Our next environment session is on Monday, August the 18th. I hope you can join us then. Anna Rose, who Ari's just mentioned, we are trying to get her to come along and have a chat to you all. So she's got some great things she's doing. And also a reminder that our new website is live, so please do spread the word of that. That'll enable us to keep growing and developing our group. We're currently up to circa 640 members and obviously looking to continue to build and increase this and our impact over the coming months and years. So thanks again, everyone, and hope to see you again soon.